Oh, I didn't know I was already dead the first time the road bent away from me. I only knew the storm was getting louder, the night heavier, and the feeling in my chest like something had already decided how this would end. I had planned the drive to be simple: visit family, turn around, push through the night, make it back before work. 8 hours of highway hum and caffeine. But the weather had other ideas. The wind battered my car hard enough to shove it sideways, rain drumming on the roof like it wanted in. The radio faded in and out, swallowed by static. When the headlights finally caught the fallen tree blocking the road, another driver was already stopped, hazard lights blinking weakly. I waited maybe 10 seconds before impatience won. I checked my phone, no signal bars, but the map still loaded. A thin gray line appeared, offering a detour through back roads. It claimed 20 extra minutes. I told myself that was nothing. The pavement vanished almost immediately. The road narrowed into cracked asphalt and potholes filled with rainwater that splashed up and rattled my undercarriage. Fields stretched out on one side, dark and endless, while a wall of pine trees pressed close on the other. No houses, no lights, just my headlights tunneling through the rain. I leaned back in my seat, trying to relax, reminding myself that nothing ever happens on roads like this. That's when I saw the car parked half on the shoulder, half in the ditch, so suddenly that I barely had time to react. I swerved too late. The impact was light but sharp, a jolt that snapped me forward as plastic cracked. I rolled to a stop several yards ahead, heart racing, breath loud in my ears. For a moment I considered driving on. No one had seen me. The storm would wash everything away, but guilt has a way of sounding reasonable when you're alone. I grabbed a scrap of paper from my glove compartment, wrote down my information, and stuffed some cash in my pocket. The other car was old, beige, dented, forgotten by time. As I leaned close to leave the note under the wiper, I noticed duffel bags piled in the back seat. Too many, packed tight. Something about them made my stomach knot, though I couldn't have said why. I was halfway back to my car when movement caught my eye. A figure emerged from the trees, walking calmly despite the rain. He carried a shovel over one shoulder, mud clinging to the blade, and in his other hand was another duffel bag. That made 4. He didn't hurry, he didn't shout. He just kept walking toward me like this was exactly where he expected to be. The unease I'd been brushing off settled deep and heavy in my gut. I slid into my driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, complained, then caught. Relief surged until knuckles rapped against my window. I turned my head and the man looked back at me with a flat, practiced expression. He raised one hand and made a slow circular motion as if asking for patience. Then I noticed what he was holding in the other. I shut the engine off and stepped back into the rain, telling myself this would take less than a minute. I tucked the paper under my jacket to keep it dry and walked toward the other car. Up close, it looked older than I first thought. The paint dulled to a color that couldn't decide between beige and gray. The rear window was fogged from the cold, but I wiped it with my sleeve anyway. That's when I saw them clearly: duffel bags, stacked awkwardly across the back seat and footwell. They were heavy duty, the kind meant to be dragged, not carried, and each one bulged at odd angles like they were packed in a hurry. I remember thinking it was none of my business, that people haul strange things all the time. Still, my eyes lingered. I slipped the note under the wiper, added the cash, and turned back toward my car, eager to be done with it. I didn't hear him at first. The rain covered the sound of footsteps, and the wind bent the trees enough to make them creak and sigh. I only noticed movement when I was already halfway back. A man was walking toward me from the tree line on the right side of the road, emerging as if he'd been standing there the whole time. He was maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, average height, average build, the kind of face you forget the moment you look away. He wore a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, rain dripping from the brim. Resting on his shoulder was a shovel, its metal blade streaked with wet earth. In his free hand, he carried another duffel bag. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked mildly inconvenienced, like I'd interrupted a routine. I picked up my pace, boots splashing through shallow puddles, suddenly very aware of how alone the road was. I reached my door, slid into the seat, and slammed it shut. My hand shook as I turned the key. The engine hesitated, coughing like it might die, and I felt panic spike sharp and sudden. Then it caught. I exhaled, already imagining myself pulling away when a firm knock landed on the driver's side window. Not frantic, not angry, deliberate. I turned my head slowly. He was standing inches away now, rain running down his face, eyes steady on mine. In his hand was a pistol, held low but unmistakable. He lifted his free hand and made a gentle rolling gesture, the universal sign for calm down. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the storm. "No need to rush," he said. "Just a short conversation before you go." I cracked the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I apologized about the taillight, asked him if he could lower the gun. He smiled, thin and humorless, and said he would mind, actually. Then before I could react, he reached through the gap, unlocked the door, and pulled it open. He stepped back and motioned for me to get out, the gun now raised just enough to make the message clear. My mind raced through useless possibilities, slamming the door, flooring the gas, screaming, but none of them felt real with that barrel pointed at me. "I didn't see anything," I said, the words tumbling out too fast. "I'm just passing through." He nodded like that, confirmed something he already knew. "I'm sure you are," he replied and gestured with the gun toward the edge of the road. "Step over there, we'll talk where it's quieter." He led me a few steps off the road, closer to the trees, and that's when I understood what was happening. It wasn't the gun that gave it away. It was the way he kept talking, asking pointless questions, commenting on the weather, nodding along to my nervous explanations like we were two strangers waiting out the rain together. He wanted me standing still, wanted my feet planted in the mud, my attention pulled forward. I remember noticing how the forest swallowed sound, how the wind seemed to drop the moment we stepped away from the asphalt. He pointed out into the darkness and asked if I could see something between the trees. I leaned forward, squinting, rain stinging my eyes. There was nothing there. No movement, no shape, just black trunks and wet leaves. The realization hit me a second too late. There was a sharp, concussive crack, louder than the storm, louder than anything I'd ever heard. Then everything stopped. There was no pain. That was the strangest part. No burning, no impact. Just an abrupt absence, like someone had flipped a switch inside my head. Sound vanished first. The rain, the wind, the man's voice, all gone. Then came pressure, crushing and total, squeezing in from every direction at once. My thoughts scattered, stretched thin, and then snapped. Darkness followed, not the soft kind you close your eyes into, but something dense and physical. I didn't feel myself fall. I didn't feel myself die. One moment I was there, and the next there was nothing at all. No time, no body, no sense of self, just a blank that swallowed everything I thought I was. When sensation returned, it did so violently. My lungs spasmed as something thick and gritty forced its way into my mouth. I tried to inhale and gagged instead, choking on soil that packed itself against my teeth and tongue. Panic exploded through me as I realized I couldn't move properly. My arms scraped against something close and unyielding, my fingers clawing at damp earth inches from my face. I thrashed, sending dirt cascading down onto my head, filling my ears, my nose, my throat. I screamed, but it came out as a muffled gurgle, swallowed immediately. Instinct took over. I dug. I didn't think about how impossible it was or how I shouldn't have been alive to begin with. I just dug, scraping and tearing with my hands until my nails bent back and pain finally registered. The soil was loose, wet, heavy, but it gave way. Bit by bit, space opened up. Air touched my fingertips. Then my face broke through and I dragged myself up, coughing and retching under the open night sky. I lay there for a long moment, chest heaving, rain washing mud from my face as my heart hammered like it was trying to escape my ribs. I pressed my hands to the back of my head, expecting blood, bone, something, anything to explain how I was still breathing. There was nothing. No wound. Not even a sore spot. My clothes were soaked and caked with dirt, but my body felt intact, whole in a way that made no sense. When I finally pushed myself upright, my eyes landed on something that made my stomach drop. Just inches from where I'd clawed my way out of the ground stood a rough wooden marker, two uneven planks nailed together into a crooked cross. It wasn't old. The wood was fresh, the edges sharp, the nails still bright. It marked the place I'd been buried. It marked me. And in that moment, staring at a grave that already had a sign, I understood something was deeply, horribly wrong. Once my breathing slowed, I took stock of myself, and that only deepened the unease. My wallet was gone. My phone, my keys, everything I'd had in my pockets was missing, as if someone had taken their time going through me after I was buried. I ran my fingers through my hair again, harder this time, searching for proof that the gunshot had been real. There was nothing. My skin was unbroken, my skull smooth. I felt whole in a way that felt wrong, like waking up from surgery without a scar. I pushed myself to my feet and finally looked around. The grave sat in the center of a clearing I hadn't noticed before, a wide open space ringed by tall pines. Covering the ground were flowers, hundreds of them pale and faintly luminous under the moonlight. Their petals were an off-white color that looked almost blue in the dark, and they swayed gently even though the air had gone still. I didn't recognize them. They weren't wildflowers I'd ever seen growing in a place like this. The wooden marker loomed behind me, and the more I stared at it, the more deliberate it felt. This wasn't a rushed act. Someone had brought the wood. Someone had taken the time to hammer it together and place it just right. A grave with a sign meant intent. It meant planning. The thought sent a chill through me, and I stepped away from the spot, suddenly desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had decided this was where I belonged. As I moved through the clearing, the flowers brushed against my legs, cool and dry, their stems bending easily beneath my weight. I had the unsettling impression that they were leaning toward me, not away. That feeling only grew stronger once I reached the tree line. The forest seemed to watch me back, every dark gap between trunks feeling like an unblinking eye. I picked a direction and started walking. I didn't know where I was going. Only that standing still felt like a mistake. Time became slippery almost immediately. My legs burned and my lungs ached. But the forest never seemed to change. No matter how far I walked, the trees looked the same. The ground sloped the same way. The silence pressed in just as tightly. I checked the sky more than once, expecting the moon to have moved, but it hung in the same place. Frozen. Doubt crept in. Had I been walking for minutes or hours? I couldn't tell. Every so often I would stop, certain I'd heard footsteps behind me, or the soft whisper of something moving through the flowers. Each time I turned, there was nothing. Only the forest holding its breath. When the sky finally began to lighten, it caught me off guard. Gray seeped in at the edges of the darkness, and the moon faded like it had never been there at all. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. Dawn meant time was still moving. It meant the world hadn't ended with me in that clearing. I pushed forward, exhaustion dragging at every step until the trees thinned and the ground leveled out. Then I saw it, a strip of cracked asphalt cutting through the landscape. A road. I stumbled onto it just as the sun crested the horizon, painting the world in cold, ordinary light. I stood there, shaking, covered in mud and flowers, trying to convince myself that what had happened was real and terrified of what it meant if it was. The road stayed empty for a long time. I walked along the shoulder, waving weakly at nothing, until headlights finally appeared behind me, slow and cautious. A pickup truck pulled alongside, window rolling down to reveal a woman with tired eyes and graying hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked me over, mud-torn clothes, shaking hands, and sighed like she'd already guessed the shape of my night. Her name was Lena Moros. She asked if I was lost. I said yes. She asked if I was hurt. I didn't know how to answer that. I asked her to call the police and she shook her head gently, explaining that out here nothing short of a fire brought them out before morning. Instead, she offered me a ride. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she offered me her spare room. I hesitated, every instinct screaming that trusting anyone was dangerous, but exhaustion won. I climbed into the truck and the warmth hit me so hard my vision blurred. For the first time since the gunshot, I felt like my body remembered how to be human. At her house, I lied. I told her I'd been mugged, that my car was stolen, that I must have wandered off the road in shock. The story tasted wrong in my mouth, but it was the only one that didn't sound insane. Lena listened without interrupting, nodding in all the right places. She gave me clean clothes, microwave leftovers, and showed me to a small guest room that smelled faintly of dust and laundry soap. I slept, but not the way people are supposed to. Every time I drifted off, I heard it again, the crack of the gun, sharp and final. My body jerked awake over and over, heart racing, hands clawing at the sheets as if they were dirt. Even in dreams, I felt that pressure, that sudden nothingness. Morning came too soon, dragging me back into my body with a dull ache behind my eyes and a sense that something fundamental had shifted while I wasn't looking. Over breakfast, Lena scrolled through her phone, frowning at the screen. She mentioned the road where she'd found me, said it had a bad reputation. Then she turned the phone toward me and asked if I recognized the man in the photo. My stomach dropped. It was him, older than I remembered but unmistakable. Same forgettable face, same eyes. She explained that he'd been found dead in his car weeks ago, parked not far from where she'd picked me up. Natural causes, according to the post. I stared at the date beneath his picture, my hands going numb as she kept talking. Weeks ago, that alone was impossible. Then she added something else almost casually, that there had been a missing person report matching my description filed over a month earlier. I felt the room tilt, the edges of reality pulling apart like wet paper. I didn't finish my breakfast. I couldn't. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow disbelief. I tried to reason it out, tried to tell myself there had to be a mistake, that dates got mixed up, that small towns exaggerated stories to fill the quiet, but none of it stuck. I remembered the marker, the flowers, the way time had stretched and snapped in the forest. Lena kept talking, kind and concerned, asking if I wanted to rest more, if I needed help contacting family. I nodded when appropriate, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, circling a single impossible thought. If the man who shot me had been dead for weeks, and I'd been missing for over a month, then the night on that road hadn't just taken my life, it had taken my place in time. Lena offered to drive me into town once the shock wore off, and I accepted because standing still felt dangerous. The town was small enough that it barely qualified as one, just a main road, a few shops and houses scattered like afterthoughts. As we drove, she mentioned where the man had lived, pointing up a side street that climbed a shallow hill. I asked her to drop me off nearby, unsure how to explain why I needed to see it for myself. When I stepped out of the truck, the air felt colder somehow, sharper. His house stood apart from the others, a squat structure painted white with red trim that had faded to pink. It looked abandoned, not in the dramatic sense, but in the way a place looks when it's been forgotten on purpose. The front door hung crooked in its frame, lock broken, paint chipped where someone had forced it open. Inside, the house was eerily bare. No pictures and no decorations. The walls were clean in a way that felt wrong, like they'd been wiped down rather than lived in. The furniture that remained was cheap and sparse, pushed aside or overturned. The kitchen held almost nothing. An empty fridge, a few mismatched plates, a jar of something pickled and forgotten. It didn't feel like the home of a man with a past. It felt like a set someone had already struck, leaving only the outline of a life behind. As I moved deeper into the house, the signs of disturbance became impossible to ignore. Floorboards in the living room had been pried up, leaving splintered wood and deep scratches in the subfloor. Someone had searched here with urgency, tearing into the structure itself as if convinced something was hidden underneath. Cigarette butts littered one corner, though the place didn't smell like smoke, only dust and old air. I checked the bedroom, then the bathroom. Nothing personal, no photos, no paperwork, no letters. There was no evidence of family, no hint of relationships, no trace of a history that might explain why he'd done what he did. It was as if he'd been trying to erase himself long before he ever met me. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by absence, and felt a creeping sense of unease settle into my bones. I had come looking for answers, motive, madness, something concrete to anchor the nightmare. But there was nothing to hold on to. The house offered no story, no reason, no comfort. Instead, it reflected my own growing uncertainty back at me. If this man could live, kill, and die without leaving a mark, what did that say about me? About the fact that I was standing here at all. I left the house feeling more hollow than when I'd entered, my questions multiplying instead of shrinking. As I stepped back onto the street, a thought I didn't want began to take shape. Maybe the anomaly wasn't the man who'd pulled the trigger. Maybe it was me, the thing that didn't belong, walking around in a world that had already moved on without it. The motel sat at the edge of town, a low concrete building with a flickering vacancy sign that buzzed faintly in the cold air. I hadn't planned on stopping there, but my legs carried me in anyway, like they remembered something I didn't. The woman behind the counter looked up as I approached, irritation flashing across her face before I even spoke. She asked if I was finally back to get my things. I told her she must be mistaken. She frowned, tapped her pen against the desk, and said I'd been staying there for days, on and off, always paying in cash, always keeping to myself. When I told her I'd never been there before, she laughed once, sharp and humorless, and slid a key across the counter. Room 12. She said she'd give me 20 minutes to clear it out if I wasn't planning to stay. The way she looked at me made it clear this wasn't a debate. The hallway smelled like old carpet and disinfectant. Standing outside room 12, my chest tightened, a dull pressure building, as if my body recognized the place before my mind could catch up. The door opened easily. Inside, the room looked lived in, not messy but occupied. A duffel bag sat open on the bed, clothes folded inside, my size, my style, down to the worn hoodie I always favored. In the bathroom, a toothbrush rested in a cracked plastic holder identical to the one I'd used for years. I stared at it longer than I should have, my reflection warped in the mirror behind it. This wasn't coincidence. This was familiarity without memory, and it scared me more than the gun ever had. I started searching with shaking hands, driven by a certainty I couldn't explain. I checked drawers, the nightstand under the bed. My pulse spiked when I dropped to my knees and reached into the narrow gap between the mattress and the wall. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a phone. My phone. The screen was dark, but it felt right in my hand, like an extension of me. I hadn't known was missing. Tucked beneath it was a small black lockbox, heavier than it looked. I stared at the keypad, my mind blank, then without thinking pressed in 4 numbers. The lock clicked open instantly. My stomach turned as if something inside me had just been confirmed. Inside the box was a gun, identical to the one the man had used on me. Beside it sat a thick stack of cash and a notebook, its cover bent and stained. I opened it slowly, dread pooling in my chest. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mine. Page after page detailed days I couldn't remember, waking up confused, trying to get help, discovering the man who killed me was already dead. Notes, circled dates, counted days, warned of things I hadn't yet felt but already understood. It was like reading instructions written by a version of myself who knew more than I did and had failed anyway. I sat on the edge of the bed, the room pressing in around me, realizing the worst part wasn't that I'd lost time. It was that someone wearing my face had been living my life without me, and I had no idea where he'd gone or why I was here now instead. I read the notebook in pieces at first, flipping pages at random, afraid that if I followed it in order I'd see exactly how I was supposed to end. The entries were dated. though the dates themselves made my head spin. According to them, I woke up in the flower field every 10 days like clockwork, crawling out of the same patch of earth with the same confusion and terror. Each time I believed it was the first, each time I was wrong. The writing described a pattern so consistent it felt mechanical: 7, maybe 8 days of frantic movement followed by sudden collapse, organ failure, cardiac arrest, sometimes in public, sometimes alone. One entry mentioned waking up on a hospital gurney just long enough to see the ceiling lights blur before everything went dark again. Another ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page. I had to stop reading after that, my hands shaking too badly to hold the notebook steady. One section was marked with heavy lines in capital letters as if written in panic. It explained that the authorities knew about me, or at least a version of me. I'd gone to the police more than once, according to the notes, only to be told I was already dead. Death certificate issued. Body unrecovered. Case closed. Trying to correct it only caused confusion and suspicion, and in one instance ended with me collapsing in the station lobby. Declared dead for a second time. The notebook warned against contacting family, not out of cruelty but because it had already been tried. Phone calls that ended in tears. Faces that looked at me like I was a ghost or a liar. The world, it seemed, had made room for my absence, and it didn't appreciate me trying to step back into it. The later pages cataloged attempts to break the cycle, research into local history, folklore, theories scribbled out and replaced with others just as desperate. One version tried to leave town, hitching rides and stealing a bike, only to wake up again in the field days later with no memory of how he died. Another version tried to end it on his own terms, hoping that choosing the moment would make a difference. It didn't. Every path circled back to the same beginning. Reading those pages felt like watching someone drown in slow motion, knowing I was next in line to sink. As the hours passed, I became aware of my body in a way I hadn't before. My joints ached when I moved, stiff and uncooperative as if rusted from the inside. My chest felt tight, not with panic, but with something deeper, slower. When I pressed my fingers to my neck, my pulse was there but sluggish, each beat spaced too far apart. The notebook mentioned this too, how the body started to fail earlier with each cycle, how the time between waking and dying grew shorter. I closed the book and stared at the wall, a cold understanding settling over me. This wasn't a curse that could be outrun or outsmarted. It was a schedule, and it was already counting down. I heard about the bones by accident. I was sitting in a corner booth at a diner near the motel, pushing cold food around a plate I had no intention of finishing, when two men at the counter started talking in low voices. They sounded like locals, comfortable, bored, filling silence with rumors. One of them mentioned a traffic stop outside town, how the police had searched an abandoned car and found duffel bags stuffed with bones, human bones. What made it strange, he said, was that the remains matched the owner of the car almost perfectly. Same age, same structure, same dental records. The other man laughed nervously and joked about long-lost twins, but neither of them sounded convinced. My hands went numb around the coffee mug. The image of those duffel bags flashed in my mind, heavy and misshapen, and suddenly I understood why the man in the storm had been digging. I didn't go back to the motel. I bought a shovel at a hardware store instead, paid cash, and walked out without looking at anyone. The path back to the clearing came back to me in pieces, like muscle memory filling in gaps my mind couldn't reach. The trees opened up exactly where I remembered, and the field of pale flowers waited in silence, untouched by time. The wooden marker still stood where I'd left it, leaning slightly, as if it had always been there and always would be. I chose a spot a few yards away and started digging. The soil was softer the deeper I went, dark and damp, almost welcoming. My arms burned, my breath came ragged. But I didn't stop. I knew I wouldn't. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Eventually, the shovel struck something solid with a dull, hollow thud. I dropped to my knees and cleared the dirt away with my hands. The smell hit me first. chemical and sweet and unmistakably wrong. A black body bag lay beneath the soil, sealed tight, edges stained from where the earth had pressed against it. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might give out right there, but some detached part of me insisted on seeing it through. I pulled at the zipper, my fingers clumsy and weak, until it finally gave. Face inside was mine, pale still, every feature exactly as I knew it, down to a small scar near the eyebrow I'd gotten as a kid. My eyes were closed, my expression calm in a way I'd never felt. At the back of the skull, partially hidden by dried blood and matted hair, was a single perfect bullet hole. I retched into the dirt, my body folding in on itself as the reality settled in. I sat there for a long time, staring at myself, and the truth arranged itself with terrible clarity. The man on the road hadn't been a random killer. He'd been like me, trapped, repeating, waking up again and again until his body couldn't take it anymore. He'd dug up his own remains, packed them away, tried to understand what he was, what he'd become, and when he realized there was only one way out, he'd done the unthinkable. Killing me hadn't been cruelty, it had been transfer, a passing of the burden. The cycle didn't end, it moved on. I closed the bag with shaking hands, the moral weight crushing down on me. Now I understood why he'd apologized, why he'd left money behind. He hadn't been asking forgiveness. He'd been saying goodbye. And standing there in that field with my own corpse at my feet, I realized the choice he'd made was now waiting for me too. I spent the rest of that day preparing to do what the man before me had done. The gun felt heavier than it had any right to, even before I loaded it. I kept telling myself it was practical, necessary, even merciful. If the cycle demanded a replacement, then choosing someone quickly, cleanly would spare them the slow decay I was already feeling creep into my joints and chest. By evening, I was back on the same stretch of road, rain pooling in familiar potholes, shovel planted in the dirt beside me. I told myself I wouldn't hesitate. That hesitation was what trapped people like us. Cars passed without slowing, headlights washing over me and disappearing into the dark. With every minute, my heart beat slower, heavier, like it was already tired of keeping me here. When the pickup truck finally slowed, my stomach dropped. I recognized it before it stopped completely. The same dent in the door, the same radio hum cutting off as the window rolled down. Lena leaned across the seat, peering out at me with concern etched deep into her face. She asked what I was doing back there. Said this road seemed to follow me around. I didn't answer. My hand tightened around the gun hidden behind my leg. She kept talking, filling the silence the way kind people do when they sense something is wrong. She said she wouldn't pretend to understand my situation, but she could tell I'd seen something that stuck with me, something heavy. She told me that when things got bad for her, when the world felt too sharp to touch, she tried to help someone else. Not because it fixed everything, but because it reminded her she was still here. I don't know how long I stood there listening to her voice, the words barely registering as my thoughts spiraled. All I could see was the field, the grave, the body bag. All I could hear was the ticking clock inside my chest. It would have been easy to raise the gun, easy to end it right there. But something about her being there, about the randomness of it, broke through the inevitability I'd wrapped myself in. If everything was truly fixed, truly unchangeable, then I would have already read about this moment in the notebook. I would have warned myself. The fact that I hadn't meant there was still uncertainty, still space. Maybe hope wasn't the solution. Maybe it was the flaw, the crack in the system that allowed things to shift, just enough. I lowered the gun. My arm felt impossibly heavy as I did it, like I was pushing against gravity itself. I told her I just needed a minute, asked her to wait. She nodded without question. I walked back toward the trees, toward the clearing that had claimed me, and for the first time since I'd woken up there, I didn't feel like I was being watched. At the marker, I pulled a scrap of paper from my pocket and wrote carefully, forcing my hands to steady. I explained as much as I could without letting fear bleed through the words. I told the next version of me what I'd learned, what I believed. I nailed the note to the wood and stepped back, hoping it would be enough. I didn't return to the road that night. Lena insisted I come with her instead, and I didn't fight it. As the days passed, my body continued its slow decline. My fingers stiffened. My breathing grew shallow, but the panic eased, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance, maybe. I avoided the motel. I stayed out of sight. I made sure no one would find me when the time came. When my heart finally began to falter in earnest, I wasn't afraid. I thought about first breaths, about how every version of me woke up believing there was still time. Maybe there was. Maybe there always would be, for someone. As my vision dimmed and the world softened at the edges, I held on to that thought. I didn't know what waited in the ground this time. I only knew I wouldn't be the one to pass it on.